You are lying awake in bed long after everyone else has fallen asleep. The room is dark. The noise of the day is gone. No distractions, no conversations, no music, no notifications, just you and your thoughts. And then something happens that most people rarely admit out loud. A question appears, not because you wanted it to, not because you were searching for it. It simply arrives, quietly, relentlessly. What if the thing I am most certain about is the very thing I have never truly examined? Most people believe doubt begins when faith becomes weak. But what if doubt begins when faith becomes strong enough to survive honesty? That possibility alone creates an uncomfortable tension, because many of us have spent years believing that certainty is the opposite of questioning. Yet every meaningful decision in life is questioned. Every relationship, every dream, every fear, every goal, everything except sometimes the beliefs we inherited before we were old enough to understand them. Imagine a child sitting in a room listening to adults explain how the world works. The child trusts them completely, not because evidence has been examined, not because alternatives have been compared, but because trust comes before understanding. That is how every human being begins. We inherit language, we inherit customs, we inherit values, we inherit fears, we inherit hopes, we inherit explanations. Years later, those inherited ideas feel like personal discoveries, even when they arrived long before critical thinking did. And this is where the question starts becoming uncomfortable. Not because it proves anything, not because it disproves anything, but because it exposes a possibility many people avoid. How much of what you believe belongs to you? And how much simply arrived before you learned how to evaluate it? That question alone has the power to create tension inside almost anyone. Not because the answer is obvious, because the answer is not obvious at all. Think about a moment when you were absolutely convinced about something and later discovered you were wrong. Most people have experienced this. A relationship they trusted, a person they admired, a plan they believed would work, a future they were certain would happen. The confidence felt real, the certainty felt real, the emotion felt real. Yet reality turned out differently. That realization reveals something profound about the human mind. Sincerity and accuracy are not the same thing. A person can be completely sincere and still be mistaken. Most people agree with that statement until it approaches their deepest convictions. Then suddenly the conversation becomes personal. Because the question is no longer about ideas, it becomes about identity, about family, about belonging, about meaning, about purpose, about fear, about hope. And that is why this particular question feels dangerous. Not because it attacks belief, because it forces us to examine the psychological foundations beneath belief. Somewhere in your life you have probably encountered someone whose convictions were completely different from yours, yet they were just as sincere, just as devoted, just as emotionally invested, just as confident, maybe even willing to sacrifice everything for what they believed. If sincerity alone determines truth, then conflicting beliefs somehow become equally true at the same time. If sincerity does not determine truth, then confidence alone cannot settle the matter. This is where many people begin to feel uncomfortable because the conversation moves away from easy answers. It enters uncertainty, and uncertainty is something human beings naturally resist. We crave stability, we crave certainty, we crave conclusions. We want solid ground beneath our feet. But what if part of maturity is learning to stand inside uncertainty without immediately running from it? If this thought has ever crossed your mind, leave your perspective below. Not because there is one correct response, but because many people wrestle with these questions privately and assume they are alone. The reality is that countless people carry these thoughts silently, afraid of what others might think if they spoke honestly. Now imagine two people experiencing the same tragedy. One sees it as evidence of divine purpose, another sees it as evidence of randomness. Both are looking at the exact same event. Yet they arrive at completely different conclusions. Why? Because human beings never experience reality directly. We experience reality through interpretation, through stories, through frameworks, through expectations, through assumptions. The event matters, But the lens matters too. This becomes especially important when discussing faith because many people assume they are examining reality itself when they may actually be examining their interpretation of reality. The distinction seems small until you realize how much of human life depends upon interpretation. Think about heartbreak. One person experiences rejection and concludes they are unworthy of love. Another experiences the same rejection and concludes they simply met the wrong person. Same event, different meaning, different outcome. Human beings are meaning-making creatures. We constantly transform experiences into narratives. We search for explanations because uncertainty feels unbearable. Yet sometimes the explanations we choose reveal more about our psychological needs than about reality itself. That observation is not aimed at any particular belief system. It applies to everyone. Believers, skeptics, optimists, pessimists, all of us. We are constantly balancing evidence, emotion, experience, memory, fear, hope, and identity. We like to imagine ourselves as purely rational beings, but most decisions happen long before logic arrives to explain them. Have you ever noticed how quickly people defend beliefs that feel connected to who they are? The reaction is often immediate, emotional, protective, not because they have carefully analyzed every argument, because the belief has become intertwined with identity. Attacking the idea feels like attacking the person. Challenging the assumption feels like threatening belonging itself. This is where the question hidden inside this conversation becomes even more uncomfortable. What if the greatest obstacle to discovering truth is not ignorance, but attachment? What if human beings sometimes defend ideas not because they know they are true, but because losing them would feel like losing part of themselves? Sit with that possibility for a moment, not as an accusation, as an observation. Because everyone does this in some form. Political beliefs, social beliefs, personal beliefs, philosophical beliefs, religious beliefs. We become attached to conclusions because they provide stability, they create order inside a chaotic world. Yet attachment can also make honest examination difficult. Imagine holding something so tightly that you become afraid to look at it closely. Not because inspection would necessarily destroy it, because inspection introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty feels threatening. That feeling leads us toward the question that causes so much tension. The question itself is surprisingly simple. If a belief is true, should it fear examination? Notice how uncomfortable that becomes when applied consistently, not only to faith, to everything, relationships, institutions, traditions, assumptions, worldviews. If something is true, questioning it should eventually strengthen understanding rather than destroy it. Yet many people fear the question itself more than the answer. Why? Because questions have consequences. They create movement, they disrupt certainty, they force reflection, they open doors that cannot easily be closed again. And once a person begins genuinely examining why they believe what they believe, they often discover something unexpected. The deepest struggle is rarely intellectual. It is emotional, it is psychological, it is existential, because beneath every argument lies a deeper human concern. What if I am wrong? What would that mean? What would I lose? What would change? What would remain? Those questions reach far beyond philosophy. They touch identity itself. And that is why people often avoid them, not because they lack intelligence, because they understand the emotional cost of uncertainty. Yet there is another side to this story that many people overlook. Sometimes the willingness to confront uncertainty reveals strength rather than weakness. Sometimes asking difficult questions demonstrates confidence rather than doubt. Sometimes honesty requires more courage than certainty, and perhaps that is why this question remains so powerful, not because it produces easy answers. Because it exposes something universal about human nature. Every person wants truth, but every person also wants comfort. The tension between those desires creates one of the most profound struggles in human experience. What happens when truth and comfort seem to point in different directions? Most people never fully confront that conflict. They stay busy, distracted, occupied, entertained. But late at night, in moments of silence, when the noise disappears and only thought remains, the conflict often returns, quietly, patiently, waiting, not demanding immediate conclusions, not offering simple solutions, just asking whether certainty comes from understanding or whether sometimes certainty comes from fear of uncertainty itself. And the reason this question feels so difficult is because it does not target one group of people. It targets something much deeper. It targets the universal human desire to feel safe inside a world filled with unknowns. It forces us to ask whether our convictions are built on examination or familiarity, on evidence or inheritance, on understanding or repetition. And perhaps the most uncomfortable possibility of all is that many people have never truly separated those things. If you have ever struggled with that tension, or if you disagree completely, share your perspective below, because the conversation becomes far more interesting when people speak honestly about the questions they usually keep hidden. What comes next is where the tension becomes even harder to ignore. Because the question is not simply whether a belief can survive examination. The deeper question is whether the human mind is willing to examine itself. Think back to the last argument you witnessed that changed absolutely nothing. Maybe it happened online, maybe it happened around a dinner table, maybe it happened between friends. Two people presented evidence. Two people defended their positions. Two people spoke with complete confidence. Hours passed, emotions intensified. Voices became firmer, yet when everything was over, neither side moved even 1 inch. It is a strangely common experience. Human beings claim to be searching for truth, yet often behave as though they are protecting territory. The goal quietly shifts from understanding to defending, from exploring to preserving, from questioning to winning, and that observation leads directly into something most people would rather avoid. What if the greatest challenge facing any belief is not an external critic, but the human tendency to protect our existing conclusions? Imagine a man who spends decades building a house. Every room reflects his choices. Every wall carries memories. Every object has meaning. One day, someone points to a crack in the foundation. The observation may be accurate. It may even be helpful. Yet the man feels attacked. Why? Because the house is no longer just a structure. It has become part of him. This same psychological process appears everywhere in human life. Ideas become extensions of identity. Opinions become symbols of belonging. Beliefs become emotional homes. Once that happens, criticism feels personal, even when it is not intended that way. Suddenly, the conversation is no longer about whether something is true. It becomes about whether the person feels safe. This matters because many people assume their deepest convictions are the result of pure reasoning. But psychologists have long observed something fascinating. Human beings often arrive at conclusions emotionally and then build logical explanations afterward. The logic feels real because it is real. Yet the emotional commitment often arrived first. Consider how people choose careers, relationships, political views, lifestyles, communities, and countless other aspects of life. Very few decisions emerge from detached analysis alone. Emotion, experience, upbringing, social influence, fear, hope, and personal history are woven into every conclusion. This does not mean people are irrational. It means people are human. And the moment we recognize that fact, the conversation becomes far more complicated than simple arguments about right and wrong. Imagine two children born on opposite sides of the world, different cultures, different languages, different traditions, different assumptions about reality. Each grows up surrounded by people they trust. Each learns what is considered normal. Each inherits explanations that feel self-evident. Decades later, they encounter one another. Both are intelligent. Both are sincere. Both are convinced. Yet their conclusions differ dramatically. What exactly created the difference? Was it intelligence, character, honesty? Or was it something much deeper and more complicated? This question unsettles people because it forces us to acknowledge the enormous influence of circumstances we never chose. None of us selected the family that raised us. None of us selected the century we were born into. None of us selected the culture that shaped our earliest assumptions. These influences do not determine our beliefs completely, but they undeniably affect them. The realization can be deeply uncomfortable because it introduces humility where certainty once existed. Suddenly, we must consider the possibility that some of our strongest convictions may have developed under conditions we did not create and barely noticed. For some viewers, this realization feels threatening. For others, it feels liberating. Because humility and uncertainty are often mistaken for weakness when they may actually represent intellectual courage. Think about scientific progress throughout history. Many ideas once considered obvious eventually collapsed under closer examination, not because people were foolish, because they were working with limited information. What appears self-evident in one era may appear incomplete in another. Human knowledge is filled with revisions, corrections, and discoveries. That does not mean truth does not exist. It means human beings frequently overestimate how much of it they possess. And this brings us closer to the tension hidden beneath the title of this conversation. The question that many people fear is not whether their faith can answer difficult challenges. The question is whether they can tolerate uncertainty long enough to hear the challenge honestly. Notice the difference. One concerns the strength of a belief. The other concerns the psychology of the believer. A belief might survive every question imaginable. But if a person is terrified of questions themselves, the conversation ends before it begins. This distinction changes everything, because the issue is no longer about religion, philosophy, skepticism, or any particular worldview. The issue becomes psychological. How do human beings react when certainty is threatened? Some become defensive, some become curious, some become angry, some become fearful, some become fascinated. Yet nearly everyone feels something. Why? Because certainty provides comfort. It reduces anxiety. It creates order. It helps us navigate a world that often feels unpredictable. Remove certainty, and people frequently experience something close to vertigo. Suddenly the ground feels unstable. The future feels unclear. Meaning itself can feel vulnerable. If you have ever experienced that sensation, you know how powerful it can be. Perhaps it happened after losing someone, perhaps after a personal failure, perhaps after a betrayal, perhaps during a crisis that shattered assumptions you once considered permanent. Life has a way of confronting people with questions they never wanted to ask. Questions about fairness, questions about suffering, questions about meaning, questions about purpose, questions about whether reality aligns with our expectations. And it is often during those moments that inherited certainty begins colliding with lived experience. Imagine a woman who spends years believing that good actions always lead to good outcomes. Then tragedy enters her life without warning. The formula breaks. The expectation collapses. The world suddenly appears more complicated than she imagined. What happens next? Does she abandon everything she once believed? Not necessarily. Does she ignore the contradiction? Sometimes. Or does she begin wrestling with deeper questions that force her understanding to evolve? That possibility is perhaps the most interesting of all, because growth often begins where certainty ends. Not certainty about reality itself, but certainty about our own understanding of reality. Somewhere along the way, many people learned that questioning and believing are enemies. Yet history suggests something different. Some of the deepest thinkers, philosophers, theologians, scientists, writers, and explorers spent their lives asking questions. They were not content with easy answers. They pushed deeper. They challenged assumptions. They examined contradictions. They followed uncomfortable possibilities, not because they hated truth, because they valued it enough to investigate it. And here is where the conversation becomes even more personal. Ask yourself honestly whether there are questions you avoid, not because they have been answered, because they make you uncomfortable. Every person has them. Questions about relationships, questions about regrets, questions about mortality, questions about identity, questions about meaning, questions about whether the life they are living truly reflects the person they want to become. Avoidance is one of humanity's most universal behaviors. We avoid what threatens us emotionally, yet avoidance often grants those fears more power. The questions remain, quietly waiting, growing larger in the shadows. This is why the most transformative moments in life rarely occur when everything feels secure. They often occur when certainty breaks, when assumptions fail, when expectations collapse, when old explanations stop working. Those moments are painful, yet they are also opportunities. opportunities to see reality differently, opportunities to mature, opportunities to develop a deeper relationship with truth rather than merely a comfortable relationship with certainty. Somewhere right now, a person watching this is remembering a question they buried years ago, a question they dismissed, a question they feared, a question they convinced themselves was dangerous, not because they found an answer, because they feared where the search might lead. If that describes you, write your perspective below, not your conclusion, your experience. Because many people assume they are alone in these struggles when the opposite is often true. Across the world, countless individuals wrestle with uncertainty in silence. They wonder if others feel the same tension. They wonder if others have experienced the same doubts, fears, conflicts, and contradictions. The answer is yes, far more people than you realize. Yet the most surprising part of this entire discussion may be what comes next, because up to this point we have talked about beliefs, assumptions, certainty, identity. But we have not yet touched the deeper issue hiding beneath them all. The possibility that the question threatening your faith may not actually be about faith at all. It may be about something far more fundamental, something buried deep within human psychology, something that influences nearly every decision you make, every conclusion you reach, every fear you carry, and every story you tell yourself about who you are. And once that possibility enters the conversation, the entire question changes. Imagine standing at the edge of a cliff during a heavy fog. You know there is land somewhere beyond the mist, but you cannot see it. Every instinct inside you wants certainty. Every instinct wants the fog to disappear. Every instinct wants a guarantee. Yet life rarely provides guarantees, and that simple reality may explain far more about human belief than most people realize, because beneath arguments, beneath philosophies, beneath ideologies, beneath traditions, beneath convictions of every kind, there often exists a deeper force quietly shaping human behavior, the fear of uncertainty. Not ordinary uncertainty, existential uncertainty, the uncertainty of not knowing why we are here, not knowing what happens after death, not knowing whether suffering has meaning, not knowing whether justice ultimately prevails, not knowing whether our lives matter beyond the brief years we spend on this planet. These questions are not merely intellectual puzzles, they strike directly at the emotional core of human existence, and perhaps that is why they have survived every generation, every civilization, every technological revolution. Human beings have changed their tools, their governments, their lifestyles, and their understanding of the universe. Yet these questions remain, waiting, persistent, unfinished. There is a reason people become emotional when discussing them, because beneath every argument often lies a personal story, a loss, a fear, a hope, a wound, a longing, a memory. Consider the man who lost someone he loved more than words can describe. For years he shared meals, conversations, laughter, routines, dreams, and ordinary moments with that person. Then one day, they were gone. The silence that follows such a loss can be overwhelming. The empty chair, the unused phone number, the familiar places that suddenly feel unfamiliar. In those moments, people often discover that questions they once treated as abstract suddenly become intensely personal. Questions about meaning are no longer philosophical exercises. They become emotional necessities. Questions about purpose are no longer intellectual curiosities. They become survival mechanisms. Questions about what lies beyond this life become intertwined with grief itself. Now consider another person who endured years of suffering and injustice. They watched cruel people succeed while kind people struggled. They witnessed tragedy that seemed random. They experienced pain that appeared undeserved. For them, the question becomes different. They are not merely asking whether life has meaning. They are asking whether reality is ultimately fair, whether justice exists beyond what can currently be seen, whether suffering serves a purpose or simply happens. Notice what both stories have in common. The questions emerge from human experience, not from abstract theories, not from detached reasoning. They emerge from the emotional realities of being human. This is where many discussions go wrong. People often assume beliefs are formed entirely through logic, when in reality, they are deeply connected to the experiences that shape us. A person who has lived through extraordinary suffering may ask different questions than someone who has not. A person who has experienced profound loss may seek different answers than someone who has not. Human beings do not reason in a vacuum. We reason through the lens of our lives, and that realization leads directly to the question that has been hiding beneath this entire conversation. What if the question your faith would not survive is not about evidence, arguments, doctrines, or philosophies at all? What if it is this? If every comforting belief were removed tomorrow, who would you be? Sit with that for a moment. Not what would you believe, who would you be? Because those are very different questions. Many people spend years building identities around certainty. They know who they are because they know what they believe. They know where they belong because they know which answers they accept. They know how to interpret the world because they have frameworks that provide structure. But imagine those frameworks disappearing. Not necessarily because they are false, simply because they are unavailable. What remains? Would you still have compassion? Would you still seek truth? Would you still care about others? Would you still search for meaning? Would you still pursue goodness? Would you still possess the courage to face uncertainty honestly? This question creates discomfort because it moves beneath belief itself. It asks whether identity depends entirely on certainty or whether something deeper exists underneath. Many people discover that what they feared losing was never merely a belief. It was belonging, community, purpose, direction, security, familiarity. Human beings often confuse these things. We assume we are protecting truth when we may actually be protecting emotional stability. Again, this observation is not directed at one group of people. It applies to everyone. Skeptics protect assumptions. Believers protect assumptions. Optimists protect assumptions. Cynics protect assumptions. Every human mind constructs narratives that help organize reality, and every human mind resists challenges to those narratives. This is not a flaw unique to certain individuals. It is a feature of being human. Yet awareness changes everything. The moment you recognize this tendency in yourself, you become capable of examining it. You become capable of asking whether your conclusions are driven by evidence, emotion, fear, hope, habit, identity, or some combination of all of them. That level of self-examination is rare because it requires vulnerability. It requires admitting that certainty sometimes feels better than honesty. It requires acknowledging that humans often crave answers even more than they crave truth. And perhaps this is why the most profound questions rarely provide immediate relief. They create tension instead. They expose contradictions. They reveal blind spots. They force reflection. Think about every significant transformation you have experienced in life. Becoming an adult, ending a relationship, starting over after failure, recovering from loss, changing careers, moving to a new place. Almost every meaningful transformation began with uncertainty. At the time, uncertainty felt frightening. Looking back, it often appears necessary. Growth required leaving something familiar behind. Growth required admitting that old assumptions no longer fit reality. Growth required entering territory where answers were incomplete. Why should our deepest questions be any different? Why should the search for understanding be exempt from the discomfort that accompanies every other form of growth? Perhaps the real danger is not questioning. Perhaps the real danger is refusing to question because we fear what the process might reveal. Not because questioning automatically destroys belief, because refusing to question can prevent belief from becoming something deeper, more mature, more honest, and more resilient. There is a powerful irony hidden here. Many people spend years protecting their certainty because they fear uncertainty. Yet uncertainty is unavoidable. No human being possesses complete knowledge. No human being sees the entire picture. No human being escapes mystery. Whether discussing existence, consciousness, morality, suffering, death, or purpose, every person eventually encounters limits. The limits of knowledge, the limits of understanding, the limits of certainty. Some respond by pretending those limits do not exist. Others respond by embracing humility. And humility may be one of the most underestimated virtues in modern life. Not weakness, not indecision, not passivity. Humility is the recognition that reality may be larger than our current understanding of it. That recognition does not eliminate conviction. It changes the relationship we have with conviction. It allows confidence without arrogance, curiosity without fear, exploration without panic. And perhaps that brings us to the final realization hidden inside this entire journey. The question your faith would not survive may not actually exist, or perhaps it exists for some people but not for others. The more important issue is whether your relationship with certainty can survive questioning, because beliefs that depend entirely on avoiding difficult questions often remain fragile. But beliefs examined honestly may become stronger, more nuanced, and more grounded. The same is true of skepticism. The same is true of every worldview. What ultimately matters is not whether you emerge with identical conclusions. What matters is whether you are willing to confront the questions honestly. Whether you are willing to examine not only your beliefs, but also the psychological needs attached to them. Whether you are willing to look directly at uncertainty without immediately demanding comfort. Because somewhere beyond the fear of uncertainty lies something surprising. Freedom. Freedom to think. Freedom to explore. Freedom to question. Freedom to admit what you do not know. Freedom to pursue understanding without being controlled by the fear of where the search might lead. And perhaps that is the deepest challenge hidden within this entire conversation. Not whether your faith survives the question. Not whether your skepticism survives the question. Not whether your worldview survives the question. But whether your identity can survive the realization that being human means living with mysteries that may never be fully resolved. Some people spend their lives running from that reality. Others learn to live within it, and those who learn to live within it often discover something unexpected. The absence of absolute certainty is not always a threat. Sometimes it is the beginning of genuine wisdom.